Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the summit. I'm your co host, Dr. Mike Sapiro, and I'm here with Alex Howard. He is the founder of Conscious Life and co host of the Super Conference series. He is also the founder of the Optimum Health Clinic, one of the world's leading integrative medicine clinics, with a team of 25 full time practitioners supporting thousands of patients in 50 plus countries. Alex is the creator of therapeutic coaching modality and has documented his work with real life patients via his In Therapy with Alex Howard YouTube series since 2020. Alex is the author of Why Me and Decode Your Fatigue. His latest book, It's Not Your Fault, Why Childhood Trauma Shapes You and How to Break Free, was published in 2023. Alex, welcome to our summit. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I wonder if we could just start off, where is this coming from within you? Where does the drive to help people with optimal health and well-being come from?
Yeah, I think like for a lot of people, this wasn't the career path that I chose. This was the career path that chose me. I suffered from ME, otherwise known as chronic fatigue syndrome, for 7 years, from my mid-teens to my early 20s. And the first couple of years of that was really waiting for someone else to find the answers. I remember going to see many different nutritionists, naturopaths, medical doctors, alternative health practitioners. My grandmother, who sort of partly raised us, was very ahead of her time in many ways. We're talking about the kind of mid-90s here. But a couple of years in, and really nothing had changed. Lots of things had changed for the worse, in the sense that I'd lost contact with my friends, I was barely attending school. I was suffering from debilitating fatigue, muscle pains, dizziness. And it wasn't that, I don't believe that depression and anxiety were the causes of fatigue. They were the consequences of fatigue.
Right.
But like when your whole life is basically devastated, it's a pretty reasonable response that you start to have a lot of concern and anxiety about what the future might be, and sense of sort of depression, hopelessness about the life that you're now living. And I basically reached the point where I wasn't practically planning how I was going to end my life, but I'd lost all hope for the future in my life. And I had, there's that kind of famous phrase that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And I had a very fortuitous conversation where basically I was helped to realize that if I wanted the circumstances of my life to be different, then I was going to have to be the one to change them. And that set off the next 5 years of a very intense healing journey. These things always sound quite romantic in hindsight because when they got happy endings to the stories. But at the time, it was really a living hell much of the time. But along the way, what I often say is I didn't find the answer that I was looking for. What I found were many answers. And what I came to realize is that complex chronic illnesses, I think the same is true for healing from trauma, the same is true for overcoming anxiety, sleep issues, whatever it may be, is they're multifaceted conditions that have different pieces of a jigsaw. And what I realized was for each person to map their path to healing or their path to transformation, they first got to decode and figure out what's happening. And then with that clarity comes the pathway to answers. And so that was really how my journey started. And then I went on to set up the organization that I'd longed to exist in the years that I had been ill. And that was and that is, the Optimum Health Clinic, which has now been going for over 20 years. My work is primarily as a psychology practitioner. I'm using a methodology that I co-created called therapeutic coaching. But at the clinic, we have a team of functional medicine informed nutritional therapists alongside our therapeutic coaching psychology team. So like a lot of people, my journey was really through my own suffering and my own kind of journey to find a pathway out.
I would love to go a little bit deeper into something that sparked my interest, because so many people watching this, they're interested in that pivot. They're suffering, or some of them are ready but not sure what to do. You said there was a moment that the teacher came. You were trying different things, but I would love to give people a sense of what does that really mean for you, and how would you encourage people to make that small pivot toward what's actually going to start healing them? What was that moment like?
Well, it was really a conversation that had a series of questions. And, the questions were very simple questions, but for me, they were transformational. So the questions were, the first question was on a scale of 0 to 10, how badly do you want this situation to change? And I remember thinking, it's funny, I don't know why I came up with this at the time, but I decided that I wouldn't murder someone and I wouldn't chop off one of my limbs. But apart from that, apparently everything else was game. So I decided that I was a 9.5 out of 10. Like I'd do pretty much anything to change a situation. I was then asked to make a list of all the things that I thought could help my situation. And I mentioned at this point, I'd been to see a bunch of different practitioners. I'd read a couple of books on sort of self-development. So I had on there things like meditation, yoga, learning more about my psychology, working more on my nutrition, getting more informed about what was really going on. So I had a list of things. I was then asked. So this was the mid 90s, 1998, I think this was actually. So there wasn't social media, but there was, of course, TV. It wasn't good TV like there is now. But the question I was asked was, how many hours a day do you spend watching television? And of course, my story at the time was, well, I didn't have the energy to do anything else. And so I would often be lying on the sofa, kind of incapacitated, just flicking through the channels. And 5 channels it was in those days, not the 500 channels we have now. And the answer was I was watching 7 hours a day of television. And the final question was, how many hours a day do you spend doing the things that you believe could make a difference? And the answer was basically none. So I'm a 9.5 out of 10. I want the situation to change more than anything. I've got a list of things I could do. I'm not doing them, but I'm spending 7 hours a day watching pointless television.
Right.
And it was the kind of contrast of that conversation that was like, if I want the circumstances of my life to be different, then I'm going to have to do something that's different. And so I made a series of commitments on the back of it. And it was things like I wouldn't watch more than 2 hours of television a day. I would meditate for, I think it was initially 15 minutes every day. I would do 5 minutes of very gentle yoga. I mean, at the time, it was like lying on my back and sort of raising my arms up and down because I'd lost all kind of strength in my body. It was to start reading books on sort of, inspirational books and books on health and self-development. And initially there was some enthusiasm, like, right, it was a little bit like the Karate Kid. It's like, right, I've got my training program, right? Like I'm gonna commit and I'm gonna do something. But then the months went by, and of course, not a lot was changing, and it kind of went from an initial like, right, I'm going to do this, to a lot of grit, a lot of patience, a lot of determination. But along the way, of course, you start to have little wins. And when you've worked for those wins, they're really what become the fuel, because you realize that it's taking time and it's difficult, but one can impact the situation that they're in. And just swapping 5 hours a day of television for 5 hours of committed self-development, that's a lot of time one can spend.
Yes. So I heard something I think would be really important for the audience to understand. You said the story I was believing, or the story I believed, or my story at the time was I couldn't do more than that. And what that implies to me is it's not actually true, but you believed it. It's a story you believed. There's so many people that I see and that we do work where it's the story itself is what they're attached to. And we have to make a shift out of that to say, well, that's not actually true. So could you share what your technique does, or how you work with people about, hey, your story might be keeping you exactly where you're at itself?
Yeah, I think about it, there's actually 3 different stories. There's the stories we were told, like the cultural beliefs we grew up in, the beliefs of our caregivers, of our community, of our school, of our family, and so on. So there's the stories we were told. There's then the stories that we came to believe. Now, for some people, they just believe all the stories they were told. For other people, they come to believe the opposite, like that there's a kind of rejecting of those narratives and the adopting of a new narrative. But the stories we were told, there's the stories that we came to believe. then there's what's actually true.
Mm.
Now, the reality is that most of us don't live our lives in the truth of what's possible for us. We live our lives in all the old stories that we were told and all the old stories that we came to believe. And one of my beliefs is human beings are infinitely more capable than they realize. We are all more resilient than we realize. We all have more capacities than we realize. And this, for me, is one of the problems of a lot of mainstream psychotherapeutic and psychological approaches, which we treat people like they're broken, like they've
Mm-hmm.
got mental health problems. And, I can't do this because of my depression, or I can't do this because of my anxiety, or I have trauma, and that means that I can't do that. And, I'm the first one to say that we need to accept and recognize those things, and having an accurate label is helpful. My point is not that we shouldn't have those labels or those things don't exist. My point is that we then build stories around
Mm-hmm.
that. And then we just have our whole life becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we just gather more and more evidence, like a confirmation bias, that those stories are true. So for example, we believe, let's say that we're struggling with a chronic health condition, and we believe there's no answers to that condition. But then you find yourself in a situation like I did, and you're like, how hard have I actually tried?
Mm-hmm.
Not have I been to see a few practitioners and sort of given up on the process. Or, I've heard that meditation's helpful and tried it a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
But like, how seriously have we committed to doing
Mm-hmm.
our inner work? Because what I found for myself over the years, and the people that I've worked with, clients, students, and so on, is that there seems to be a disproportionate relationship between the level of commitment that one makes to their inner work and the actual changes that happen in their life.
Mm-hmm. The three principles that come to mind that I work with are a dedication, discipline, and consistency, which is really all commitment. Because I find those essential for making changes. I mean, we're the only ones who can do what we need to do, as you said. And so where do you think people get the dedication or the commitment from? Where does it come from within them? If someone's listening and go, I really do want to change, but I'm so tired, or it's just so hard to give this alcohol up, or whatever, how do you help them find that which truly motivates?
Yeah, yeah. I think the problem is, for a lot of people, the suffering of day-to-day life, they've normalized to,
Mm.
right? It's like most people actually don't realize how much pain they're in, because they've just normalized being in that pain. And sometimes we have to have an experience which is different to that to show us what is actually possible. Like, to put it in a slightly different way, having had and recovered from a severe chronic illness and spent 7 years of my life suffering from it, on the other side of that, I had a disproportionate sense of what was actually possible in my life. So I've done this incredibly hard thing, and that then becomes a new reference point. The problem is that we all do hard things in our lives. The problem is people don't normally give themselves credit for the hard things that they've done. So a way that can be helpful is we've got to set things up in a way that helps us win, right? Often what happens is people come out of, workshops or kind of whatever, and they've got these massive goals they want to achieve, and they're going to radically change this and that. And then a few days in, or a few weeks in, or a few months in, they haven't achieved it. Or, I knew I could do it. And then they give up. So I'm a big fan of setting the game up so that we win, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so picking manageable, achievable steps and then really committing to them. It's like part of what we're talking about here really is one's personal power, like one's ability to commit to something and follow through on it. And that's a muscle. And like all muscles, the more you work the muscle, the stronger the muscle becomes. And it's a very delicate balance between really accepting where we are, like finding that place of presence, of acceptance, of allowing, but also finding that place of we learn to know ourselves by how we show up.
Mm-hmm.
And most things in life that are really worth having take work. Be that a long-term, lasting, loving relationship, be that raising kids, be that building a career, be that overcoming a health challenge, be that doing our trauma healing work. It's like we've got to show up and commit to doing that work. But when we do, it gets easier because we get, not because the challenges get small. It's a bit like going to the gym. The weights don't get lighter, we just get stronger. And therefore, we can then manage more and we can take on more of our healing. And then the change really happens.
Mm-hmm. Would you be willing to maybe walk us through, you get a client through your whole process and give us a sense of, they come to to your clinic and they can come, it sounds like from all over the world, they can access what you're doing. What might they show up with and how might you all work with them so that someone listening now can go, oh, that is reasonable. That's not really as hard as I thought, or it's not too outlandish.
Yeah, so we work a lot with people with complex fatigue-related conditions. So a lot of things like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, long COVID, Lyme disease, co-infections. We also work a lot with healing the impacts of childhood trauma. We work a lot with anxiety, with sleep, with hormone issues. And so the beginning of all of our clinical work is we need to decode what's happening. And really, pretty much everything I just described is a label for a set of symptoms. It's not a diagnosis. Someone comes in and says, I have a diagnosis of anxiety. It's like, well, you have a name for your symptoms. You haven't got a diagnosis of why you have anxiety. Let's take that as an example. We talk about 3 different types of anxiety. It could be anxiety of the mind or mental anxiety. Could be emotional anxiety, like defending against our emotions can be a big anxiety trigger. It could also be physical anxiety. It could be anxiety which is being somatically experienced in the body, but it could also be things like blood sugar imbalances, hormone imbalances, and so on. And so to be able to map an effective pathway towards healing, we first have to really decode what's happening. And so we have a lot of, spent the last 20 plus years developing a number of different frameworks to really map what's happening, but also to look at each of these things from both psychology perspective, so from a kind of mind-body healing perspective, but also from a physiological perspective. So I mentioned we have a team of functional medicine informed nutritional therapists. So what are the imbalances in the system? Where does the system need support? What's happening with diet? Do we need to support certain things in terms of supplements? And we find that we consistently get the best results when we combine those 2 approaches together. And so our clinical teams, both in the psychology team and nutrition team, they work very closely together to make sure that we have an integrated approach. And then along the way, it's like you have that initial map and then you start the intervention in terms of what you're doing. But then you have to constantly respond to that. It's not you just write a protocol, someone goes away and does it. It's a dialogue with the client and a dialogue with the client's body in a way. Okay. I would also say that from our perspective, the client has to be an active participant in the healing journey. Right? One of the ways that I talk about it is you have to be the captain of the ship of your own recovery. This is not an approach where we're even trying to find the magic pill. We're putting together a very tried and tested framework, but it has steps. It takes time. We need to often address things in the right sequence. Sometimes you can have the right interventions in the wrong sequence. They're actually making things worse, not better. And that's the benefit of working with thousands of clients over 20 plus years. We really have learned to figure out, actually, we need to start here. And when we have that piece in balance, that's going to unlock this next piece. If we start with the next piece, we're never going to unlock the first piece. So there's a lot of internal dialogue, a lot of responding to what's happening, and it's a journey. But it's a journey that ultimately works.
When you were just saying about the order of things, that makes me think of clients or patients that come to me and want a different health outcome, want something better, but they don't love themselves. They're actually very punishing. They're maybe indulging shame or pity instead. And so they kind of rely on that narrative about themselves. I'm not really that good. But then they're like, but I really want to get better. And you're like, well, it's not, self-hatred is toxic for you. So no matter what behavior you might take on, if you're hating yourself underneath that, then most likely the medicine you're looking for is not going to work because of the toxicity of self-hatred. How do you address that? Is that true in your model? Like, that sounds like what, when you were saying the right steps might need to be looking at that first, you know?
Yeah, I think one of the ways we have to think about it is, for the body to heal, we have to be in a healing state, right? And so if all of our energy is going to fuel patterns of self-hatred and self-rejection and so on, that energy is not energy that then is available for healing. But another way, to kind of stretch it a few steps further, to cultivate a state of optimum health, the nervous system has to be well regulated, right? Like, if we're in a state of fight, flight, freeze, what I call a maladaptive stress response, like a stress response which is unnecessary to the environment we find ourselves in, right? If we're being hunted by a human eating animal, entirely appropriate to have large amounts of adrenaline and cortisol and to be in a heightened stress response, right? It's like, I remember being on a high ropes course with one of my kids and one of her friends a few years ago, and I slipped out of my harness on a high rope. It was like very appropriate to have large amounts of adrenaline and cortisol. One of the few times in my life I genuinely thought I was going to die, right? It's like, that's appropriate. Right. The problem is when we don't require that stress response, but we've become normalized to being in that state. It's like our nervous system is responding when there's not actual, maybe perceived danger, but there's not actual danger. It takes a huge amount of energy to fuel being in that state. Now, if we have, to go back to your question, if we have a pattern around self-hatred and self-rejection, then we get to the end of the day and we're physically and emotionally drained and tired. And what we need is to go home and practice self-care. Maybe soak in a hot bath, have some nourishing food, have an early night, like take care of ourselves. But then we think about the projects at work where we feel like we're not doing a good enough job, and we get home and we spend 3 hours unnecessarily basically working because we're trying to win the love of our boss or our colleagues to prove that we're enough. Or we get a loved one that sends us a message and they're not in like a genuine crisis, but they want to come over and hang out. And it will be totally okay for us to say no. It's just not okay for us to say no because our self-worth is linked to always being there for other people. So there's many, many different examples like this where we effectively reject ourselves, we reject our body to take care of and to respond to everyone else. And so self-hatred and sort of lack of self-love, it has a direct impact on our nervous system, but it actually has a direct impact on our behaviors, like how we live our life day to day. And that has a massive impact upon our physical body, our emotional body, our mental health, and so on. And so in answer to your question, like, well, what do we do about it? Well, the first thing is we've really got to recognize what is going on. If you can see it, you don't have to be it. If we have the awareness, hang on a second, I'm not in a good relationship with myself. I ignore my feelings. I constantly push my body. I don't practice self-care. A lot of my thoughts are kind of cruel and judgmental towards myself. So if I can see that that's what's happening, sometimes the awareness alone is enough to start changing some of those things. What would it look like to be more self-caring and self-loving? But also, if we can see what's happening, we can start to seek out effective interventions, effective support. Maybe we can start asking for help. And if that's really hard, the fact we recognize it's hard to ask for help is a step. We got awareness about that, and we can start something about it. But I'm a really big supporter of this idea that we first got to really diagnose or to decode what's happening. There's many things we can do, but if we have the clarity, then we can start to find the right pathways.
Yeah, self-awareness is certainly seems like the basis for so many changes people want to make. You can't change something you're not aware of. It's kind of that easy and simple. Are there methods you teach for self awareness, like mindfulness based or meditation based, or just simply slowing down, watching? How do you encourage clients or patients to start being aware of themselves?
Yeah, I find meditation is very helpful. One of the things that we're learning to do in meditation is we're learning to loosen the grip that our thoughts have on us, right? Many of us we hold our beliefs, our stories, our thoughts too tightly, right? It's like never is that more obvious than when there's an election, or when there's a sort of, a falling out of two positions on social media. And we see how quickly people cling to the stories and the beliefs. But the thing that makes me most nervous is how certain some people seem to be about some really complicated things. And it's
Mm,
like this like really rigid certainty about things. One of the things meditation helps us to do is, by the practice of recognizing thoughts, but not going with those thoughts, like learning to bring our attention back, depending on the type of meditation practice, but the way that I teach meditation, coming back to our breath, coming back to our body, coming back to the moment, we're relaxing the rigidity with which we hold our thoughts and our positions. Like we start to create a little bit more space in ourselves, but more space in our minds, in our narratives. So to see what's happening, that's often a helpful starting point,
mhm,
right? That we can just start to loosen how tightly we hold on to the old story. And then what we really need is effective frameworks to really
mm,
map what's going on. Like we've loosened the positions and we've loosened the grip, but then, like, well, how do we make sense of our experience? Right? And if we
mm,
can have effective frameworks, we can start to bring some understanding and bring some logic to what's happening. And then we can start to do something about it. Be
mhm,
that cultivating a daily meditation practice, be that cultivating a practice of working on nervous system regulation, be that a practice on working on self-care or self-love, be that a practice of working on creating healthy boundaries in our friendships, in our relationships. There's many
mhm,
different paths we can go down, but we need to recognize that A, we got to find a path, and B, to try and choose the right path.
mhm. I find it really interesting that so many people's even medical issues, physiological issues, are so tied deeply to their beliefs about themselves. And I also find it ironic that it's so hard to give up those very beliefs that keep us trapped in the very issues we're facing. Do you find some clients really don't want to give up beliefs that they have about themselves in the world? And how do you work with that? I'm thinking about some audience members who might be like, I don't want to give that belief up, even though it's actually detrimental to their well being.
I remember couples therapist once said to me, he said, "Do you want to be right, or do you want to be happy? Like, because you can't have both. It's like, 'cause if you want to be right in a relationship with someone, you always want to be right. Like, you need to be right to feel safe or to feel loved, whatever it is. Then that means you're always going to make the other person wrong. And if you make the other person wrong in a long-term intimate relationship consistently, you won't be happy in that relationship. They will be unhappy, therefore you will. Unless you're a sociopath, if you have empathy and the other person's unhappy, you will be unhappy. And I think the same is true in life. It's like, do you want to hold on to the old story, or do you want life to change? Because you probably can't have both. Because the old story is probably a lot of what's driving the suffering. Right? Like if the old story is that, I don't have what it takes to change, then, I'm not one of those people typically that believes that your thoughts create your reality. I know there's a whole kind of body of teaching ideas around that. And I have strong opinions that we don't have to go into now. But what I believe and what I observe is what we believe determines what we do. What we do determines our reality. So if I don't believe it's possible for me to change, am I going to commit to the practices that could help me change? Am I going to ask for the help and support? Am I going to put my time and money and resources into doing therapy workshops, or am I going to keep spending them on, whatever it is, going out, drinking, gaming, whatever it is that's kind of got me in a rut? And so often we have basically a confirmation bias. We have a belief system and we keep finding evidence that reinforces that belief system.
Mm-hmm.
If we challenge and we change the belief system, we can start to gather evidence for a new set of beliefs. Like, one of the ways that I think about it is the belief is like the top of the table, and the evidence are like the legs for the table. So we maybe have the belief that it's not possible for us to change. And we have lots of, that's the top of the table. We have lots of legs for that table. The memories of the times that we set goals on New Year and we hadn't followed through past 3 days. The times that we sort of tried to get fit and we gave up after going to the gym 3 times, like whatever it may. We have all these evidence for this belief. Mm-hmm. And then we've got this new belief that we're exploring, which is that change is possible, but we have to commit to doing the work. And let's say we get inspired and we do a daily meditation practice for a month. And at the end of that month, we do notice some things are different. We're a bit calmer, we're a bit less reactive, sleeping a little bit better. We notice that we're eating a bit better because we're a bit more mindful, our appetite's a bit more under control. Now, that new belief, still a bit flimsy, but we just put a leg under that table. Mm-hmm. And then we go and gather a few more legs to that table. And then before we know it, it starts to feel a bit more steady. Like this mm-hmm. idea that I can create change, but I've got to commit to the process, mm-hmm. starts to become the new belief and the new story. And so that process, one of the things that it takes courage. Mm-hmm. It takes the willingness for things to be unfamiliar, uncertain, different. Like, there's a kind of classic thing that people come into therapeutic work wanting their lives to be different, but not wanting to change. Mm-hmm. Right? We want the external stuff to change. We don't want to change the internal stuff. But if we start to discover that we can create change, and actually when we create change, life gets better, not worse, that starts to become the new norm. It's like, another way of thinking about it is that often we conflate familiarity with safety. Like, we all have a need to feel safe, but we think we're safe when things are the same, when things are familiar. If we can start to develop a level of comfort with unfamiliarity, with new situations, and we can learn to become more comfortable with that, then we can start to commit more to that process of creating change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's simple. It's not easy, but it's actually quite simple. And I think I often tell my clients, we can do this the simple or hard way, but neither way is easy.
Yeah.
It just takes courage to do something different. And so many are afraid of the unknown. The familiar is, okay, at least I can rest in this. I don't like it, but I can rest in it. The unknown's scary. How do you teach people to go into which all of life is the unknown? It's all a mystery all the time. We're just comfortable with the sun rising, setting. We think we know patterns. The truth is, it's always a mystery. How do you help people become familiar and comfortable with the mystery or the unknown so that they can more bravely, with courage, go into their future?
Yeah, I think part of that is a practice. You mentioned about meditation, and the role of that earlier. One of the things that one learns in good meditation training is how to stay present, even when things are uncomfortable, when things might feel unfamiliar. But one learns to find a place of safety within oneself. Like, if we can, and this is often a number of steps down the journey, but if one can unhook their sense of comfort and safety from the environment of what's happening around them, one is in a way truly liberated. Mm-hmm. Because then we can do hard things, go to hard places, and still feel safe inside of ourselves. It's like, as children, that there are blessings and curses to childhood and adulthood. Like, one of the curses of childhood is we are basically dependent. Certainly as babies, we're completely dependent. That level of dependence gradually diminishes over time, but we are dependent upon our caregivers to meet our core needs for ourselves. Our core needs for us, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we all have core emotional needs, like the need to feel safe, core emotional needs like the need to feel love. And as children, we are dependent. One of the blessings, there are curses of being adulthood. We will have to be responsible. We have to kind of earn our own money and kind of manage our own life. Some of that stuff can be hard for some of us at different points. But one of the blessings is we are no longer dependent upon someone else to meet our needs for us. Mm-hmm. It can be a journey. It is a journey. But we can learn to meet our core emotional needs for ourselves. Mm-hmm. That's the practice and that's the work. Mm-hmm. It's like we learn how to cultivate a sense of inner safety, how to cultivate a quality of inner love. And if we do that, that has so many kind of compounded blessings through our life.
I'd like to stick on this for a while because I think for me as well, that is the linchpin. It is a foundation. I often ask, do you trust yourself? Where have you betrayed yourself and not forgiven? But more, are you actually safe with yourself and do you have your own back? And so many are like, no, I don't trust myself. I've done so many things to hurt myself. I haven't forgiven yet. And also I don't feel safe because I make poor choices for this organism, my mind, my heart, and my spirit. And so for me, I say, how can we get you to have your own back? So in any situation, in any occurrence, and that is hope for me. Hope is not that things are going to be better in the future, is that I have my own back and I know whatever happens, I'm there for myself in the future. So I wonder if you could speak to how do we become safe with ourselves from your teachings and your practice? And then what is hope? Is hope a part of this as well?
Yeah. One of the ways that I think about this is, so I think about it from the perspective of self-esteem and self-worth. To me, there are two ways that we build self-esteem and self-worth. There's innate self-esteem and there's earned self-esteem, right? So innate self-esteem is what we got or we didn't get in childhood, right? Mm-hmm. Being loved for who we were as we were, not for what we did, for what we achieved, but being adored, loved. And this is often not a measure of whether our parents did love us. It's a measure of whether they were skillful in meeting our core emotional need of love. Parents that would do anything for a child, they just didn't know how to do this piece. But innate self-esteem is the self-esteem that one gets for just being human and being loved and being adored. But that's not the only part of self-esteem that's important. And in a way, I think there's a younger generation at the moment that have over-indexed on that. And then when it didn't get met, there's a sort of victim narrative that can often come from that. Of course, it's a great blessing in life if that sort of innate self-esteem need is met. But it's certainly not met perfectly for the majority of people. And for most people, it's probably not met very well. But whatever we do or don't get, there is always earned self-esteem. Mm-hmm. And earned self-esteem is the self-esteem that you get through doing hard things, through doing the right thing. And I think the real key bit here is not just doing the right thing because other people are looking, not just doing the right thing because you're going to get in trouble if you don't do the right thing, but doing the right thing because it's the right thing. And the people that I've come to really respect and admire over the years are the people that when no one's looking, you know that they still do the right thing. But there are also often the people that have real, true self-worth. Because to go back to your point, they have other people's back, but they also have their own back. Like they're going to stand for themselves, and when they recognize that they're living their life in a way that's self-defeating, there's a willingness, a courage to see that and to do something that's different. And, the reality is we all start where we are, right? So if where we are right now is I had a comment on a YouTube video a few weeks ago where, I was talking about the inner critic and that judgmental voice that we all have. And the comment was, but what if the inner critic is true? What if you are being an ass to other people? What if you are lazy? What if you are sort of, constantly failing to follow through on your promises? And my response was, change. It's like you do something that's different. Mm-hmm. You will, wherever you start from, earn your own respect. Mm. Treat yourself in a way which is caring and loving. And if we start there, firstly, we will start to build that earned self-esteem. The funny thing, though, as well, is the relationships in our life will start to change because we'll start to have different boundaries. We'll start,
Mm-hmm.
if we have a high value of how we treat ourselves, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
notice when other people don't treat us in those ways.
Totally. Yeah. Mm-hmm. One of my best friends and I were just having a conversation that all of a sudden his ex-wife of many years who they were in constant conflict is being kind to him and changed. And I'm like, do you think it has something to do with how you've started taking care of yourself differently, going to therapy, setting boundaries? The things you're doing might be reflected. You know, the world seems to be a mirror. It's not like she's all of a sudden super different. Maybe he's showing up different because of the work he's putting into his well-being, which is what I've been watching for a while now. So that's validating that. I just want our audience to know that the work we put in ourselves really does seem to get mirrored back toward us and to us.
Yeah, you can tell a lot about how someone is in relationship with themselves
Mm-hmm.
by how other people are in relationship with them. And
Mm-hmm.
if other people are treating them kindly, respectfully, with care, with interest, that's often a clue that that's how that person is treating themselves, because that's the expectation they have of others. And if we've
That's right.
got other people that are treating us horribly and we're not giving them boundaries, that's a clue that on some level we think that behavior is okay.
Right. And that maybe we deserve it or whatever the reason. I just love that for us to pay attention to it. When people are treating us poorly, it's often a mirror for how we're treating ourselves on the inside and allowing. We treat ourselves poorly, and it's easier to be like, well, they can treat me this way too. So we're really at the end of our time. I'm wondering if you could speak just directly to the audience and wish them something like what from your heart to theirs. What would you like most for them?
Well, maybe get back to something we said a little bit earlier, which is the recognition that we are all capable of far more than we realize. And if we imagine that we made our healing journey or transforming our relationships, like whichever piece of this jigsaw is that we're talking about, if that was the single most important thing in our life for a month, let's say to start with, and we made every single focused effort to changing that thing, what would happen?
Mm-hmm.
I think would probably change, right? It's like we don't know what we're capable of until we find out. And sometimes in life we find out because we have no choice. You know, we have to deal with the complex kind of health condition, or you know, with a sudden grief or whatever it may be. But we don't have to wait for something awful to happen in our lives to discover what we're capable of. In fact, start now. You know, and
Mm-hmm.
that means showing up to ourselves, committing to our practices, asking for help, doing the work, and we build our self-worth. We build our self-esteem one action at a time through doing that.
Mm-hmm. I love how practical and concise it is. Thank you so much. How can people find you? Where would you like them to find you?
Yeah, the best place to go is my website, which is alexhoward.com. On alexhoward.com, you'll find links to all the things that I do. So you'll find a link to the Optimum Health Clinic and our practitioner team. You'll find a link to our therapeutic coaching practitioner training program, link to my books. There's a free 5-day video series called Decode Your Trauma, which will help, I think, bring a lot more, some more depth and more time and space to some of the principles we talked about here. You kindly mentioned in the introduction, I have a YouTube series called In Therapy with Alex Howard, which you can find on YouTube. You can just search that, where we we film people's real life therapeutic journeys. And I think it's a great way. A lot of the things we talked about today are alive in some of those stories. I think it's a great way of showing the reality of doing inner work, that it's
Mm-hmm.
hard work, it takes time, but fundamental change really is possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for showing up for yourself as well as everybody you've served. We really appreciate you and the work you're doing. And also, thanks for coming on the summit today.
Great. Thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.